Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. As usual, I want to begin by reminding you that we have a volunteer, Charlie Fabian, who's ready and willing to take your suggestions, comments for segments to be developed for this program. You can email him at charlie.info438@gmail.com, or you can now connect through Twitter as well, the former Twitter, at Charlie Fabz, F-A-B-Z, with the F capitalized. Okay, two ways to get to Charlie and provide him, as you have been doing, with valuable suggestions that we can use. Today's program is going to be talking about unemployment, about why restaurants are in trouble in America, the irony of Janet Yellen's commentaries, and new report on tax breaks for billionaires in the United States. In our second half, we will interview Steve Early, a longtime labor activist, talking about the rising labor militancy, why it's happening, where it's going. Very important part of our culture and our society right now. So let's jump in. Many of you have asked me to talk about why the unemployment rate in the United States is, at least in historical terms, the official rate as low as it now is, 3 to 4%, etc. And my apologies, I thought I had handled that question, but I probably didn't do it in the way that it could have and should have been done. So let me do it now. The basic answer to the question, why is unemployment low, is because it has been made profitable for businesses to hire workers. Let me be blunt and clear. That's always the explanation. In other words, we have a system in which the only way the vast majority of working people get a job, earn an income, is if it is profitable for employers to hire them. We give employers in that way an unbelievable power in our society and economy. And we shouldn't be surprised if they both use it for their own advantage and abuse it for their own advantage. And they do. So the first level of answer, why is unemployment low, has to be and is that it has become more profitable than it used to be for employers to hire workers, and that's why they're doing it. And let me give you this simple arithmetic so you can understand it. Productivity, that's a number that the government keeps track of and publishes on a regular basis, as do some private research outfits. Productivity measures how much value a worker gives to his or her or their employer per hour or per day or per week. In other words, it's a measure of what we give to them, how much extra output they get because they hired us, how much better quality of output they get because they hired us. Okay? The productivity over the last 12 months rose 2.9%. And here's what that means in a simple example. If you produced 100 of whatever, haircuts, ice cream cones, software programs, doesn't matter. If you produced 100 a year ago, you are now producing 102.9. Your productivity has gone up. If the employer is paying you the same today as he did a year ago, he's better off. His profit has gone up because what you give him is 2.9% more than you gave him last year, but he's not giving you anything more because your wage is the same. So he's doing real well. But it turns out that the employer had a second advantage. He could and did raise the price. We have an inflation rate in this country of roughly 3.5%, which means over the last year that the employer not only got 2.9% more out of you, he was able to raise the price of what he got out of you by 3.5%. If you put those two together, add them up, it's 6.4%. That was what the average employer got from his employee. Over the last year, he got 6.4% more money from that worker. Okay, now the last part. Did he pay the worker more? Answer, on average, yes, 4.1%. Okay, now do the arithmetic. He paid the worker 4.1% more, but he got from the worker 6.4% more. In other words, at the end of the year, looking at what he got from his workers, he decided to hire more of them because he's making money on every worker. He is getting more from the workers than it costs him to bring them to the job. And that's why we have low unemployment. It's very, very important to understand. Profit comes from that difference, the difference between what you pay the worker and what the worker delivers to you in the way of product. There's nothing magical about it at all. Workers are getting more jobs because they're accepting to get either lower pay or no pay increase at all, which many of them don't get. Remember, if wages rose 4.1%, a quarter of that is paid in taxes. That leaves you with 3.2, 3.3%, and that's less than the rate of inflation. So workers' income was going down, but the profit employers could get off them was going up. Under those circumstances, you get hired. But you also discover that your economic situation, even though you're hired, is a difficult one and not getting any better, which the polls show Americans understand. Starbucks, turn to our next program. Starbucks is leading the way of restaurants complaining that they're a declining customer base. They are in trouble. And the leader of Starbucks tells us why. It's the end of all the government assistance that came out of the pandemic. Now that we are not giving unemployed workers a boost, now that we're not giving failing enterprises a boost, trying to get people through the pandemic, now that all of those programs have been cut back, people don't have money to spend. And you know what the message here is? We're in trouble as an economy. Our private economy can't make it. The restaurants are not making it. They depend on the government. The very thing corporations like to make fun of and say we don't need is what's holding the economy up. Here's another way to put it. We are allowing a growing inequality in this country. More and more wealth is not going to poor people, well, it never does, and is not going to the middle class. It once did. It's being concentrated at the top, which means mass consumer-based industries are having a problem, like Starbucks or any other of these kinds of businesses. They're hurting, not only because the pandemic support of the government is drying up. It's the more profound reasons. It's the inequality of this system that is undercutting more and more industries that used to depend on a well-heeled middle class, which we don't have anymore. I could, of course, go on and say on top of this, we have an inflation. And that's another problem of our private sector, which where government is coming in by raising interest rates, trying to control. We have a private capitalism in deep trouble, depending more and more on a government, even as it pretends that it doesn't need a government, doesn't want a government. When will the pretense stop? Maybe a necessary first before you can solve the problem. Then there's the remarks made by Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, speaking at the McCain Institute's Sedona Forum. Here's what she said this last week, and I quote, "It is Americans' respect for their fellow citizens' views and needs that truly underlies America's economic success." Wow. Leader of our government says that in the same week that all we saw was university presidents and police departments raiding our campuses, trying to shut down people who wanted to express a disagreement with U.S. policy in Israel and Gaza, people who wanted to protest peacefully, as they have every right to do. Is respect for other people's views and needs, which is what Janet Yellen spoke about, if that's crucial to our economic future, well, we have now damaged our economic future because university presidents and police departments and the president and the political class seem very comfortable coming down on what they mistakenly thought was a small minority point of view. Turns out to be much bigger, wider, and stronger than they thought. But it puts to shame the United States' claim that this is a democracy that welcomes dissent, that allows peaceful protest. No, no, no. This is a government that can't stand when some of the brightest people in it question government policy. They can't stand it for 1 minute once it's public. The final economic update we have time for comes out of the work of Gabriel Zuckman, Zuckman. He works with a group of people that have been keeping track, Thomas Piketty in France, Edward Size in California, of inequality in the world. It's been a project out there at University of California at Berkeley. Zuckman works with those folks. They are the go-to people keeping track of inequality in the world, both in the United States and broadly. And Gabriel Zuckman issued a new report picked up by the New York Times, which is not often the case. And here's what the bottom line is, and I thought it would interest all of you. It's a comparison between 1960 and today. So it tells us a story of what has happened over the last half century here in the United States. So let me first give you the numbers for 1960, and then I'm going to give you the numbers for 2018. These are the numbers from Mr. Zuckman. In 1960s, the 400 richest Americans, all billionaires already then, paid 56% of their income in taxes. Okay, they were billionaires, and they paid 56% of their income in taxes. In the same year, 1960, the poorest half of Americans paid 22% of their incomes in taxes. Okay, so the billionaires paid a much higher percentage of their income in taxes than the poor, 56% to 22%. Now let's fast forward to the year 2018. 400 richest Americans, again, all billionaires, paid 23% of their income. Over the last half century, the percentage of your income that you pay in taxes, if you are a billionaire, went from 56% to 23%. That is a staggering drop in the taxes on billionaires. Meanwhile, let's look at the lower half, the poorest half of the people. What percent of their income did they pay in taxes in 2018? Answer, 24%. The reason Zuckman wrote this report, and the Times picked it up, is this is the first year that the poorest half of Americans pay a higher share of their miserable income in taxes than do the billionaires. This is a country in which Republicans and Democrats alike have done that to you and me. We've come to the end of the first half of today's show. Please stay with us. Our interview with Steve Early will interest you a great deal. Folks, we don't like to spend a lot of time, or your time either, on raising money. But the facts of the matter are, as you know, that producing these programs, delivering them to you, costs money of all kinds. Anything you can do to donate, please consider doing that. You can do it by going to our website, democracyatwork.info, or to find us on patreon.com and to contribute in that way. Please know it will be enormously appreciated. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I am very proud to bring back to our microphones and cameras Steve Early, who we have spoken to in the past, but who has a special importance and relevance in my mind to talk with us again. Steve Early has been active in labor organizing and union reform efforts since the early 1970s. He's been a member or a full-time official of the Communications Workers of America, AFL-CIO, for the past 45 years. And he has been a contributor to and supporter of Labor Notes, the voice of left-wing labor and a promoter of rank-and-file insurgency since its founding in 1979 by fellow veterans of campus activism in the 1960s. Steve Early also was a co-founder of Labor for Bernie and worked on both Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns. So first of all, Steve, thank you very much for giving us your time and your experience and wisdom from it. All right,
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Here's the big question everybody wants me to ask people like you, and I do too. Something is going on at Amazon, at Starbucks, across campuses in America, at the UAW in Chattanooga and elsewhere, the settlements in Detroit by the UAW, the Teamsters at UPS. What's going on? Is there a rise in labor militancy, as certainly seems to us to be the case? And how would you explain it? Where is it coming from? Will it last? What's your sense, having been involved and an observer for as long as you have?
Well, I think it's not an overnight phenomena. It's people on the left in the labor movement have been planting the seeds in various ways for this current upsurge for many decades. And I think that was really on display a couple of weekends ago at the National Labor Notes Conference in Chicago, the largest ever gathering in the 45-year history of the group. We had close to 5,000 activists from the U.S., Canada, other countries, all the leading U.S. labor reform movements in the Teamsters, in the auto workers, in many other unions. The food and commercial workers were represented. A hugely diverse crowd, many young workers, many people of color, many people from immigrant worker centers, many more workers than have ever come to a labor notes gathering before who are not yet covered by a union contract. They're struggling for union recognition or a first contract at Starbucks, in Amazon warehouses, in public sector units in states where collective bargaining is still barred. They're functioning as a so-called non-majority union at a high-tech company like Google through an organizing vehicle like the Alphabet Workers Union. So there's an incredible array of union models, new and old, on display, and a lot of information sharing, strategizing, people learning from each other, particularly learning from the recent successful contract campaigns and strikes at UPS, the auto industry, and many media outlets in higher ed and in Hollywood.
Do you think it's underway in the sense that the momentum is carrying forward, or is that still an open question?
I think it's very much carrying forward because when we started these labor notes conferences in the early 1980s, we would get maybe 500, 600 people. Back when the labor movement was a lot bigger, when unions represented 20% of the workforce instead of the 10% that is down to today. So we were drawing on a much bigger organized labor base, but the labor left, broadly defined, was much smaller. And it was confined to people who were primarily colonizers, who had gone into industries like trucking and auto and steel making and auto manufacturing and become active as union dissidents. But as important as those rank and file movements were and ultimately became in some of those unions, there was not the diversity, there was not the youth, there was not the energy that I saw a couple of weekends ago in Chicago. And I think, part of it is a result of structural changes that people have campaigned for many years in some key unions that have enabled them for the first time um, in several cases to directly elect their top leadership. The many positive changes in the United Auto Workers that have occurred in the last year or two are the result of members winning the one member, one vote method of electing their top officers and executive board members, rather than having that process be controlled by a much smaller group of union delegates at an annual convention. Same is true of the Teamsters. New leadership there as a result of a referendum vote a couple of years ago. In my own union, the News Guild, 5 years ago, we elected a new national president, 32-year-old guy from the newsroom at the LA Times, who had just been part of an organizing campaign, beat a 10-year incumbent. And there's been tremendous revitalization in the News Guild around the country as a result of new leadership there.
All right, from one extreme to another here. Let me ask you, is Trump or the MAGA movement or whatever you want to call it, is it making any significant gains in the American working class? Is it a development there that we should understand or that you have thoughts about?
Well, we thought a lot about this when we launched Labor for Bernie in 2015, 2016, because Trump was less of a known quantity there and had great appeal to many workers because he was against free trade. Unlike Hillary Clinton, the leading contender for the Democratic Party nomination at the time, he said he was against U.S. military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. He made a lot of noises about being a friend of labor, having good relationships in the construction industry with the building trades in New York. So a lot of people were attracted to his message then, and sadly, 8 years later, some unionized workers still are. And I think unions need to do a lot more internal education and mobilization to reduce the union family vote further for Trump. Otherwise, their friend Biden is going to have a very difficult time getting reelected, particularly as the whole election turns, as we know, on the results in 6 or 7 so-called battleground states. And my own union, the Communication Workers, has formed an alliance with a progressive veterans group called Common Defense. We've identified the members of the communication workers who've served in the military. We've recruited them to become part of a Veterans for Social Change network. We've had some trainings, political education and organizing training, so that people who have these dual identities of being a military vet, being a union activist, can go out in the veteran community and try to woo more military families and more fellow former service members away from MAGA land. And I think other unions are starting to do that, particularly the postal workers and American Federation of Government Employees, who also have large numbers of ex-military people in their ranks.
All right. I want your insights about something that touches me personally, which is the extraordinary unionization movement across college and university campuses. Having been a professor all my life, I've had to live with colleagues, most of whom were very uncomfortable with the notion of a union. A union was for them something a truck driver or a steel worker did, but not something that a lofty professor would ever do. And, and this kind of thinking was passed on to students sort of naturally. So I'm amazed at what I'm seeing. I'm amazed that campuses that I knew to be very anti-union are now very pro-union. And my suspicion is that this is going to have an enormous effect because college classrooms where millions of young people pass through are now going to be taught by both graduate students and full faculty who have a much more sympathetic feeling and attitude towards labor than ever before. Is anything like that seem
Very
reasonable to
definitely.
you?
Very definitely. I mean, again, it's been a long time coming. As you may recall, as someone who was like me involved in '60s anti-war activity, one of the first high-profile efforts of graduate students, of TAs, to organize was at the University of Wisconsin more than 50 years ago. They affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers. They had a strike, definitely an outgrowth of '60s activism. Well, today you have grad students, the State University of New York system, part of my union, CWA. I worked with them on a couple of their first contracts in the 1990s. You have Unite Here, representing grad students at Yale and some other Ivy League schools. UAW has 50,000 members in higher education out here in California, mainly in the UC system. And the UE, an old left manufacturing union, has rebounded membership-wise by organizing thousands of grad students at MIT and other universities. And so you're absolutely right. This is a great training ground for a whole new generation of activists. Certainly, in my own experience with the Graduate Student Employees Union at SUNY, a bunch of people fell off the academic track in the sociology department at Binghamton, and they ended up as union organizers. And I think that's happened in a lot of these different settings where people get so involved in grad student activism, they want to make a career. And it's not necessarily in academia, but that experience as a student, as a worker, gaining practical organizing, collective bargaining skills, they can take anywhere to a later job if they become a professor with tenure track position or into the rest of the labor movement. We see that all over. It's very, very encouraging and inspiring.
Yes, I remember in the 1960s, the phrase worker-student alliance was widely used, but I see it as a more realistic possibility now than it ever was. Then it was a vague notion of a possible future. Now it seems to be actually on the agenda.
Well, not to get overly legalistic about it in terms of labor law, but I think it's very creative that UAW Local 4811 out here in California is filing unfair labor practice charges against the administration at UCLA for a unilateral rule change without any bargaining with the union. And of course, the rule change was about protest activity on campus, which affects both students and workers. So they've turned a traditional Gaza protest conflict into a labor management issue, and they may win.
Yes, and the message being sent across the country is unmistakable. Okay, we only have time for one more. A number of commentators have commented on the fact that recent Gallup polls and other kinds of polls here in the United States indicate hugely favorable feelings about unions. The latest one I saw gave a number around 70% of people wanted to be listed as favorable to unions, and that is up from way less than half, and maybe as little as a third or a quarter, not that many years ago. How do you account for what would you give us as a final thought as to why this might be happening?
Well, I think more unions have learned, as the phrase goes, to bargain for the common good, to frame their demands, particularly in field like education, public schools, not just in terms of winning much needed improvements in wages and hours and working conditions, but also changes that benefit the communities they serve. Reducing classroom size in public schools. It's a good way of winning over parents and other people who want to see improvements in public education, as well as teachers being treated better as union members. So there's lots of examples in the healthcare field. Union bargaining over job-based benefits is a nightmare. I was involved in it for 20 years. It's a no-win situation. Unions have got to be, once again, in the forefront of the fight for Medicare for all. And when they do that, people see that it's not just some selfish grab for a better health plan for themselves. That unions are fighting for a national health insurance that would benefit all workers, whether the union members or not. So it's really how you frame your organizing and bargaining demands. And if you're trying to rally the whole community and presenting yourself as a defender of the working class as a whole, you're going to get a lot more popular support. That's showing up in the polls.
Steve Early, I wish we had more time, and I hope that you will be willing to come back in a little while and keep this conversation about an emerging, real powerful labor movement going. So thank you very, very much. And I say to my audience, as always, I hope you appreciated the wisdom of Steve Early, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.